In the ancient city of Eridu, where the marshlands of southern Mesopotamia stretched toward the horizon in an endless expanse of reed beds and shallow waterways, the priests of the temple, known as the House of the Aquifer, maintained traditions that predated their own civilization by millennia. These traditions spoke of a time before writing, before cities, before the organized cultivation of grain or the domestication of animals, when humanity existed in a state that later Babylonian scholars would describe as resembling the condition of wild beasts. The transformation from that primordial condition to the sophisticated urban civilization that would eventually produce the world's first written literature, the first mathematical systems, the first astronomical observations, and the first codified legal traditions was attributed not to gradual human development or the slow accumulation of knowledge across generations, but to a single decisive intervention by beings whose nature straddled the boundary between divine messenger and primordial sage. These beings, known collectively as the Apkallu, occupied a position in Mesopotamian religious thought that no other category of supernatural entity quite matched, serving simultaneously as culture heroes who had delivered the fundamental arts of civilization, as protective spirits whose images guarded doorways and sacred spaces, as mythological figures whose stories explained the present order of the world, and as intermediaries whose existence testified to a time when the boundary between heaven and earth remained permeable in ways that the post-Diluvian world would never again experience. Across more than 3,000 years of Mesopotamian literary and religious tradition, from the earliest Sumerian texts composed in the city-states of the 3rd millennium before the Common Era through the final cuneiform tablets produced in the temples of Babylon during the Hellenistic period, the Apkallu maintained a consistent identity that proved remarkably stable, despite the profound transformations that Mesopotamian civilization underwent during this immense span of time. Their number was fixed at 7, a figure that carried profound cosmological significance in Mesopotamian thought, and that linked the Apkallu to other fundamental heptads, including the 7 planets visible to the naked eye, the 7 gates through which the goddess Ishtar descended to the underworld, the 7 demons known as the Sabiti, and the 7 sages who would later appear in Greek tradition as the founders of philosophy. Their function was equally fixed, centering on their role as bearers of the divine wisdom that made civilized existence possible, wisdom that encompassed not merely practical knowledge such as irrigation techniques or architectural methods, but the entire complex of ritual practices, divinatory arts, and sacred knowledge that Mesopotamian culture regarded as essential to maintaining the proper relationship between the human and divine realms. Their temporal location was likewise consistent across the tradition, positioned firmly in the antediluvian period when the world operated according to principles that the Great Flood would fundamentally alter, making the Apkallu figures who belonged to a lost age whose wisdom could be transmitted, but whose direct presence could never be recovered. The survival of detailed traditions concerning the Apkallu across such an extended period reflects the profound importance that Mesopotamian civilization attached to questions of cultural origin and the transmission of sacred knowledge. Unlike modern secular approaches that tend to view cultural development as an impersonal process driven by environmental pressures, technological innovations, and gradual social evolution, Mesopotamian thinkers conceived of civilization as a gift that required both a giver and specific moments of giving. The cities that dominated the Tigris-Euphrates floodplain were not merely human constructions, but divine establishments whose locations, layouts, and ritual functions had been determined in primordial time by decisions that preceded human agency. The arts practiced within those cities, from the scribal traditions that produced cuneiform literature to the exorcistic rituals that protected individuals from malevolent spirits, were not human inventions but divine revelations that had been entrusted to humanity through designated intermediaries. The Apkallu served as the primary agents of this revelatory process, functioning as the channels through which divine wisdom flowed from the realm of the gods to the realm of humanity during the uniquely privileged era that preceded the flood. The god most closely associated with the Apkallu was Enki in the Sumerian tradition, and Ea in the later Akkadian and Babylonian formulations, the deity whose domain encompassed the fresh underground waters known as the Abzu or Apsu, whose character combined profound wisdom with a trickster's cunning, and whose relationship with humanity was marked by a benevolent disposition that distinguished him from more distant or potentially hostile deities. Enkia's temple at Eridu, the Iabzu or House of the Aquifer, was regarded as the oldest temple in Mesopotamia and as the prototype from which all subsequent sacred architecture derived, a status that reflected Eridu's position in Mesopotamian mythological geography as the first city to have received kingship when that institution descended from heaven in the period before the flood. The close association between the Apkallu and Eridu, combined with their connection to the god of subterranean waters, gave the seven sages a particular character that distinguished them from other categories of primordial figures, linking them specifically to the aquatic environment of the southern Mesopotamian marshlands and to the traditions of wisdom that Enki-Ea personified. This aquatic dimension of the Apkallu's nature found expression in the iconography that depicted them in visual form, representations that survive on cylinder seals, carved reliefs, and figurines from across the history of Mesopotamian civilization. The most distinctive form showed the Apkallu as fish-cloaked figures, beings whose bodies were clothed in the skin of a fish in such a manner that the fish's head formed a hood over the sage's human head, while the fish's body and tail hung down the sage's back, creating a composite image that combined human form with aquatic attributes in a manner that visually encoded the Apkallu's emergence from the watery realm of Enki-Ea. Alternative iconographic traditions depicted the Apkallu in fully human form, often dressed in elaborate ritual garments and holding objects associated with purification rites, while a third tradition showed them as bird-headed figures with human bodies, a representation whose relationship to the original aquatic imagery remains debated among scholars, but which clearly served protective and apotropaic functions in the contexts where such images appeared. The coexistence of these varying iconographic traditions across different periods and different functional contexts testifies to the complexity of Mesopotamian religious thought, which readily accommodated multiple visual representations of the same conceptual category without perceiving contradiction. The textual traditions that preserved knowledge of the Apkallu took several distinct forms, each contributing different dimensions to the overall picture that Mesopotamian civilization maintained of these primordial sages. The most systematic presentation appeared in king lists and related historiographic documents that structured primordial time according to sequences of rulers and sages, texts that embedded the Apkallu within a chronological framework that extended from the descent of kingship from heaven through the succession of antediluvian monarchs whose reigns were measured in tens of thousands of years. The Sumerian king list, the foundational document of Mesopotamian chronographic tradition, established the framework within which later texts would situate the Apkallu by identifying the cities that held kingship before the flood and the duration of royal rule in each city, though the sages themselves did not appear explicitly in the earliest versions of this text. Later Babylonian scholars developed more elaborate presentations that explicitly correlated each of the seven Apkallu with a specific antediluvian ruler, creating parallel sequences in which each king was advised by a corresponding sage whose wisdom guided the monarch's reign, a structure that would influence later traditions concerning the relationship between secular rulers and their wise counselors. The names of the seven Apkallu varied somewhat across different textual traditions, reflecting the normal processes of transmission and adaptation that affected all aspects of Mesopotamian religious knowledge, but a core set of names recurred with sufficient consistency to establish the canonical identities of the seven sages. The first and most prominent of the Apkallu was Uana, or Oannes, whose name appears in various orthographic forms across Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Greek sources, and whose position as the initial sage gave him particular importance, as the figure who first established the patterns that subsequent Apkallu would follow. Later traditions, particularly as preserved in Greek accounts derived from Babylonian sources, made Wana Oannes the paradigmatic representative of the entire group, sometimes treating him as a singular figure who encompassed the functions attributed collectively to all seven sages. The subsequent Apkallu bore names including Wanaduga, Enemaduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utuabzu, though variations in spelling and some disagreement about the precise sequence appeared across different sources, reflecting the degree to which the tradition was subject to the normal processes of textual transmission that characterized ancient Mesopotamian scholarship. The single most detailed account of the Apkallu to survive from the ancient world appeared not in cuneiform sources directly, but in a Greek text that drew upon Babylonian traditions, the Babyloniaca composed by Berossus, a Babylonian priest who wrote in Greek during the early 3rd century before the Common Era, as a means of making Mesopotamian learning accessible to the Hellenistic world that had come to dominate the Near East following Alexander's conquests. Berossus's work survived only in fragments preserved through quotations in later Greek and Christian authors, but these fragments preserved substantial portions of his account of the Apkallu, providing a level of narrative detail that exceeded what the surviving cuneiform sources offered, while also introducing interpretive frameworks shaped by the cultural context in which Berossus wrote. The Greek transmission filtered Mesopotamian concepts through Hellenistic categories, occasionally distorting original meanings while simultaneously preserving information that might otherwise have been lost when cuneiform literacy finally disappeared during the first centuries of the Common Era. According to the accounts preserved from Berossus's work, the figure known in Greek as Oannes emerged from the Erythraean Sea, a term that ancient Greek geography applied variously to the Persian Gulf, the Arabian Sea, and the broader Indian Ocean, during the reign of a king whose name was rendered in Greek as Alorus. The creature that appeared was remarkable in its composite nature, possessing a body that combined the form of a fish with elements of human anatomy, including human feet that emerged beneath the fish's tail and a human head positioned beneath the fish's head, along with a human voice that enabled it to communicate with the people among whom it appeared, this being spent its days among humans, never consuming food, and devoted itself to teaching the arts and sciences necessary for civilized existence, including written characters, mathematical learning, architectural techniques, legal principles, and the methods of measuring land and cultivating crops. At sunset, the creature would plunge back into the sea, spending its nights beneath the waters from which it had emerged, a pattern that linked its presence to the daily cycle while maintaining its essential connection to the aquatic realm. Berossus or his sources emphasized that nothing further had been added to human knowledge since Oannes' time, an assertion that positioned the sage's teaching as complete and definitive, requiring only preservation and transmission rather than supplement or improvement. The aquatic emergence and daily return to the waters described in Berossus's account connected the Oannes tradition to the broader complex of ideas surrounding Enki and the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that Mesopotamian cosmology located beneath the surface of the earth as the source of all springs, rivers, and wells. The Abzu was simultaneously a geographical concept, a cosmological principle, and a divine realm, the domain from which Enki exercised his functions and from which the wisdom he embodied flowed into the world. The Apkallu's emergence from these waters thus marked them as bearers of the wisdom that the Abzu contained, figures whose temporary presence in the human realm constituted a direct channel through which divine knowledge could enter human consciousness. The daily rhythm of emergence and return that Berossus described encoded the fundamental pattern of this transmission, with the sage serving as an intermediary whose presence in the human world was inherently temporary, despite the permanent nature of the knowledge he conveyed. The content of the Apkallu's teaching, as described across both cuneiform and Greek sources, encompassed what Mesopotamian thought conceived as the totality of civilized knowledge, though the categories through which this knowledge was organized differed significantly from modern disciplinary divisions. The term that recurred most frequently in connection with the Apkallu was the Sumerian word mi, or the Akkadian equivalent parsu, concepts that have no precise modern equivalent, but that referred to the cosmic powers, divine attributes, and civilizational principles that determined the proper ordering of the universe. The mi included not only practical arts such as metallurgy, weaving, and agriculture, but also social institutions such as kingship, priesthood, and legal judgment, along with abstract principles such as truth, righteousness, and lamentation. The possession and proper exercise of the mi determined whether a city, a temple, or a kingdom functioned according to divine intention, while their absence or misuse resulted in disorder and suffering. The Apkallu's role as teachers of the Emi positioned them as essential mediators between the divine source of cosmic order and the human communities that required this order to sustain civilized existence. The divinatory arts held particular prominence within the knowledge that the Apkallu transmitted, reflecting the central importance of divination within Mesopotamian religious practice and the specific association between the god Enki and revelatory knowledge. Divination, in Mesopotamian understanding, was not a matter of predicting the future in the sense of forecasting events that would inevitably occur, but rather a method of reading the signs through which the gods communicated their intentions and assessments, enabling humans to understand their situation and respond appropriately through ritual action. The various techniques of divination, including the examination of animal entrails, the observation of celestial phenomena, The interpretation of unusual events and the analysis of dreams each constituted a distinct discipline with its own technical vocabulary, specialized practitioners, and accumulated body of precedent and interpretation. The Apkallu's teaching of these arts provided humanity with the means to maintain communication with the divine realm after the sages themselves had departed, a function that gave divination a foundational rather than supplementary role within Mesopotamian religious practice. The ritual knowledge that the Apkallu transmitted extended beyond divination to encompass the full range of procedures through which Mesopotamian religious practice sought to maintain cosmic order, purify individuals and spaces from contamination, and address the various spiritual dangers that threatened human well-being. The Ashipitu or exorcistic traditions that formed a major component of Mesopotamian religious life traced their origins explicitly to the Apkallu, with practitioners known as Ashipu or Mashmashu positioning themselves within a chain of transmission that extended back to the antediluvian sages. The incantations recited during rituals, the gestures performed by officiants, the materials employed in purification procedures, and the timing considerations that governed ritual activity all derived their efficacy from their origin in the wisdom that the Apkallu had delivered. This genealogical connection was not merely a matter of historical interest, but constituted an essential element of ritual effectiveness, with the antiquity and divine origin of the procedures serving as guarantees of their power. The architectural knowledge attributed to the Apkallu encompassed not merely construction techniques, but the principles governing the proper design of sacred spaces, principles that determined the layouts of temples, the orientation of structures relative to celestial phenomena, and the placement of protective figures and apotropaic imagery. The ziggurats that dominated the skylines of Mesopotamian cities, the massive step towers that served as platforms for elevated shrines, were conceived not as human architectural achievements, but as realizations of designs whose origins lay in the primordial wisdom that the Apkallu had transmitted. The ritual procedures that accompanied temple construction, including the foundation deposits placed beneath cornerstones and the ceremonies that animated cult statues, likewise derived from the antediluvian teaching, ensuring that sacred structures functioned according to divine intention, rather than merely human understanding. The claims that temple records made regarding the antiquity of particular structures and the faithful preservation of original designs reflected this conception of sacred architecture as a body of knowledge that required conservation rather than innovation. The relationship between the Apkallu and the institution of kingship constituted a particularly significant dimension of the broader tradition, reflecting the central importance that Mesopotamian political thought attached to the question of how rulers acquired the wisdom necessary for effective governance. The parallel sequences that correlated each of the 7 antediluvian kings with a corresponding Apkallu established a model in which royal authority and sage wisdom functioned as complementary elements, with the king exercising power, while the sage provided the knowledge that enabled that power to be exercised wisely. This pattern would echo through later Mesopotamian tradition in the form of the Umanu or master scholar, a figure whose relationship to the king resembled that of the Apkallu to the antediluvian monarchs, and whose role in advising rulers maintained the fundamental connection between wisdom and authority that the primordial sages had established. The scholarly traditions that maintain this connection preserve detailed records of the succession of master scholars who had served particular kings, creating lineages that implicitly trace back to the original transmission by the Apkallu. The flood that concluded the antediluvian period marked a fundamental break in the relationship between humanity and divine wisdom, transforming the conditions under which civilized existence operated, while simultaneously preserving the essential knowledge that the Apkallu had transmitted. The Mesopotamian flood tradition, known from multiple Sumerian and Akkadian versions including the story of Ziusudra, the story of Atrahasis, and the flood episode within the Epic of Gilgamesh, presented the deluge as a divine decision that effectively reset human history, destroying the existing population while preserving a single righteous individual, along with the essential elements necessary for civilized life to resume. The survival of the knowledge that the Apkallu had taught depended upon this transmission through the flood, a concept that some versions of the tradition elaborated through accounts of written tablets buried before the deluge and recovered afterward, preserving the wisdom of the sages in material form that could outlast the destruction of the antediluvian world. the post-diluvian world that emerged after the floodwaters receded operated according to different principles than the antediluvian era, with the direct presence of beings like the Apkallu no longer possible, and the relationship between humanity and the divine realm mediated through different mechanisms. Later Mesopotamian tradition distinguished between the pure or perfect Apkallu of the antediluvian period and a subsequent category of sages who appeared after the flood, figures who were described as two-thirds Apkallu or as partial inheritors of the original sage's nature, beings whose status marked them as connected to the primordial tradition, while also distinguishing them from the full divine character of the original seven. This distinction reflected the Mesopotamian conception of the flood as a transformative event that had fundamentally altered the cosmic order, making the conditions that had permitted the Apkallu's presence no longer obtainable, while preserving the knowledge they had delivered in forms that remained accessible to later generations. The protective functions that the Apkallu served in post-antediluvian contexts found expression primarily through their representation in apotropaic imagery, visual depictions that deployed the power associated with the sages to guard doorways, sacred spaces, and individuals from malevolent forces. The clay or stone figurines depicting Apkallu that archaeologists have recovered from beneath doorways and at the corners of buildings serve to repel evil spirits and prevent harmful influences from entering protected spaces, with the sages' association with divine wisdom and their origin in the realm of Enki providing the basis for their protective efficacy. The ritual texts that accompanied the creation and installation of such figurines specified the procedures through which the images were prepared, consecrated and positioned, embedding the protective function within the broader ritual system that the Apkallu themselves had originally established. The presence of these figures at palace entrances, temple gates and private doorways testified to the continuing relevance of the Apkallu tradition throughout Mesopotamian history, translating the mythological account of antediluvian teaching into ongoing protective practice. The iconographic representation of Apkallu on palace reliefs, particularly in the Assyrian period when the Neo-Assyrian Empire decorated its palatial complexes with extensive carved stone panels, provided some of the most visually striking images that have survived from ancient Mesopotamian civilization. The reliefs from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud, dating to the 9th century before the Common Era, included numerous depictions of Apkallu in both human and bird-headed forms, positioned at doorways and alongside depictions of the sacred tree that symbolized divine blessing and abundance. These figures held objects interpreted as pine cones or date palm spathe and sitular vessels, implements associated with purification rituals through which the protective power of the Apkallu was activated and directed. The scale and prominence of these images within the palatial decorative program reflected the importance that the Assyrian monarchy attached to the protective functions that the Apkallu served, presenting the king as the recipient of divine protection, conveyed through figures whose ultimate origin lay in the antediluvian transmission. The relationship between the Apkallu tradition and other categories of protective and advisory beings within Mesopotamian religion remained complex, with boundaries between distinct conceptual categories sometimes blurring across different periods and different functional contexts. The Lamassu or Shedu, the massive human-headed winged bulls and lions that guarded Assyrian palace entrances, served protective functions comparable to those of the Apkallu while maintaining distinct iconographic identities and mythological backgrounds. The personal protective spirits known as the Ailu or Shedu and Lamassu of the individual functioned within a different conceptual framework than the Apkallu, while occasionally overlapping in the context where such beings were invoked. The wise counsellor figures who appeared in literary compositions such as wisdom literature and dialogic texts drew upon models established by the Apkallu tradition, while operating within different narrative and functional frameworks. The boundaries between these various categories reflected distinctions that Mesopotamian religious thought maintained while simultaneously acknowledging connections and overlaps that complicated simple, classificatory schemes. The transmission of knowledge about the Apkallu across 3 millennia of Mesopotamian civilization depended upon the scribal traditions that maintained cuneiform literacy and that copied, edited, and transmitted the texts, preserving this knowledge from generation to generation. The scribal profession itself traced its origins to the primordial revelation of writing among the arts that the Apkallu had taught, positioning scribes within a lineage that extended back to the antediluvian sages, and that gave their professional activities a sacred dimension beyond their practical applications. The training that scribes underwent in the tablet houses and temple schools of Mesopotamian cities included not merely the technical skills of writing and reading, but also the substantive knowledge preserved in the literary, religious, and technical texts that comprise the cuneiform tradition, knowledge whose ultimate origin the tradition attributed to the Apkallu. The colophons that scribes appended to tablets they produced sometimes referenced this sacred lineage, connecting the individual copying act to the broader chain of transmission that preserved antediluvian wisdom in material form. The persistence of traditions concerning the Apkallu into the Hellenistic and later periods, as evidenced by Berossus's account and by continued references in classical sources, demonstrated the remarkable durability of Mesopotamian mythological concepts, even as the civilization that had produced them underwent fundamental transformation under successive Persian, Macedonian, and Parthian domination. The temples of Babylon continued to maintain cuneiform scholarship into the Common Era, preserving astronomical texts and religious rituals that derived from traditions extending back to the earliest Sumerian period, and the Apkallu tradition remained part of this enduring body of knowledge, even as the number of individuals capable of reading and writing cuneiform steadily diminished. The eventual disappearance of cuneiform literacy during the first centuries of the Common Era did not entirely erase knowledge of the Apkallu, which survived in the fragments of Berossus and in scattered references in later classical and early Christian literature, though the fullness of the tradition preserved in cuneiform sources would remain inaccessible until the decipherment of cuneiform in the 19th century enabled modern scholars to read the original texts once again. The recovery of cuneiform sources during the excavations that began in the mid-19th century transformed scholarly understanding of the Apkallu tradition, providing direct access to Mesopotamian accounts that had been filtered through Greek intermediaries in the versions previously known. The thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from sites including Nineveh, Babylon, Nippur, Uruk, and Assur included ritual texts, mythological compositions, historiographic documents, and lexical lists that collectively provided a far more detailed and nuanced picture of the Apkallu than classical sources alone could support. The decipherment of these texts, which proceeded gradually through the work of scholars including Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, Jules Oppert and their successors, opened access to a religious and mythological world of remarkable sophistication and complexity, a world within which the Apkallu occupied a position of fundamental importance as the mediators through whom divine wisdom had first entered human knowledge. The continuing excavation of Mesopotamian sites and the ongoing publication of cuneiform texts has steadily expanded scholarly understanding of the Apkallu tradition, revealing dimensions of the concept that earlier sources had obscured while raising new questions about the development and variation of the tradition across time and space. The position that the Apkallu occupied within Mesopotamian religious thought reflected broader patterns in how ancient cultures conceived the relationship between divine and human realms, patterns that appeared in various forms across the ancient Near East and the broader Mediterranean world, while taking distinctive shapes in each cultural context. The concept of primordial sages who had delivered essential knowledge to humanity found parallels in other traditions, including the Greek notion of culture heroes who had first established arts and institutions, the Egyptian concepts of Thoth as the inventor of writing and the gods who had first ruled Egypt, and the later Jewish and Christian traditions concerning antediluvian figures such as Enoch who had received divine revelation. These parallels reflected both the independent development of similar conceptual structures in response to similar religious and philosophical questions, and the actual transmission of ideas across cultural boundaries through trade, diplomacy, and the movement of peoples across the ancient world. The study of the Apkallu tradition thus illuminates not only Mesopotamian religion specifically, but also the broader patterns of ancient thought concerning the origins of civilization and the transmission of sacred knowledge. The account that Mesopotamian tradition preserved of the 7 sages who had descended to instruct humanity before the Great Flood represented one of the most sustained attempts by any ancient civilization to explain how the fundamental arts of civilized existence had come to be known, why certain practices and institutions possessed sacred authority, and what relationship obtained between the human communities that practiced these arts and the divine powers that had originally revealed them. The Apkallu served as the essential link in a chain of transmission that extended from the divine source of all wisdom through the antediluvian period of direct revelation and across the transformative boundary of the flood to the scribes, priests, and scholars who maintained the tradition in historical times. Their story was simultaneously a mythological account of cosmic origins, a charter for the authority of traditional knowledge, and a model for the proper relationship between wisdom and power that continued to shape Mesopotamian thinking throughout the civilization's long history. The temples that preserved their traditions, the images that depicted their forms, and the texts that recorded their teachings collectively maintained a presence for these antediluvian figures that extended across 3,000 years of continuous tradition, making the Apkallu among the most enduring of all the conceptual constructions that Mesopotamian religious imagination produced. The specific identities and characteristics attributed to each of the 7 antediluvian sages varied somewhat across different textual traditions, though a core pattern remained consistent throughout the centuries during which the Apkallu tradition was recorded and transmitted. The earliest comprehensive enumeration of the 7 appears in texts from the Kassite period, and later, building upon traditions that had circulated in oral and written forms since at least the early 2nd millennium and probably earlier. Each sage was associated with a particular antediluvian king, creating a parallel structure in which the succession of wise counselors mirrored the succession of rulers, with each sage delivering specific bodies of knowledge or establishing particular institutions that would subsequently define civilized existence. The first of the 7, whose Sumerian name Uwana became Oannes in the Greek transmission through Berossus, occupied a position of particular prominence as the initiator of the entire tradition of divine instruction. The texts described Uwana as having emerged from the sea in the reign of Alawulim, the first of the antediluvian kings who ruled at Eridu, establishing the foundational pattern by which sacred wisdom would descend from divine sources to human recipients. The knowledge that Uwana delivered encompassed the most fundamental arts of civilization, including the principles of writing, the techniques of construction, the practices of agriculture, and the methods by which humans could properly worship the gods who controlled their destinies. His instruction was understood to have established the basic framework within which all subsequent development of human culture would occur, providing the template that later sages would elaborate and extend but never fundamentally alter. The association of Uwana with Eridu possessed deep significance within Mesopotamian religious geography, reflecting the city's status as the oldest of sacred places and the original seat of the god Enki, whose wisdom formed the ultimate source from which all the Apkallu drew their knowledge. The traditions preserved in Sumerian compositions, including the text known as the Eridu Genesis, depicted Eridu as the first city to receive kingship when it descended from heaven, positioning the city as the point of original contact between divine and human realms. The emergence of Uwana from the waters surrounding Eridu thus represented not merely a geographical specification, but a theological statement about the primordial union of wisdom, water, and sacred space that underlay all subsequent civilization. The marshes and lagoons of southern Mesopotamia, where fresh water from the rivers mingled with salt water from the Persian Gulf, provided the physical setting for a mythology in which the boundaries between cosmic realms remained permeable and the depths of the waters concealed mysteries that human wisdom could only partially comprehend. The second sage, whose name appears variously as Wanduga and Nedotos, or similar forms in different textual witnesses, was associated with the second antediluvian king, and was credited with elaborating the foundations that Uwana had established. The pattern of successive sages building upon the work of their predecessors reflected Mesopotamian conceptions of knowledge as cumulative tradition rather than individual discovery, with each generation receiving wisdom from those who came before and transmitting it in enriched form to those who would follow. The specific contributions attributed to Wanduga and the subsequent sages varied across different text traditions, with some sources emphasizing their roles in establishing particular cult centers or ritual practices, while others focused on their transmission of technical arts, including metallurgy, astronomy, and the preparation of medicinal compounds. The third sage, Enmaduga, and the fourth, Enmegalama, continued the sequence of divine instruction across the reigns of the third and fourth antediluvian kings, extending the scope of revealed knowledge to encompass the full range of arts necessary for sophisticated urban civilization. The texts associated these figures with the development of increasingly complex institutions, including the temple households that would dominate Mesopotamian economic organization, the scribal schools that would preserve and transmit textual knowledge, and the ritual calendars that would synchronize human activities with cosmic cycles. The grandiose names borne by these sages, incorporating divine elements and epithets of power, reflected their status as beings who stood between the fully divine realm of the gods and the mortal realm of humanity, possessing natures that combined celestial wisdom with the capacity to communicate that wisdom in forms humans could comprehend and practice. The fifth sage, Enmepuluga, was associated in some traditions with particular advances in the technical arts, including the development of metalworking techniques and the elaboration of architectural forms that would characterize the great temple complexes of historical Mesopotamia. The ziggurat form, which represented one of the most distinctive achievements of Mesopotamian monumental architecture, was understood in some traditions to have been revealed during this period, providing a pattern for the temple towers that would subsequently rise in every major Mesopotamian city as visible symbols of the connection between earth and heaven. The technological knowledge attributed to the antediluvian sages extended beyond the purely practical to encompass what modern observers might term magical or occult arts, including the techniques of divination, exorcism, and protective ritual that formed essential components of Mesopotamian religious practice. The sixth sage, Enlilda, was credited in various traditions with contributions to the systematization of knowledge that had accumulated through the instruction of his predecessors, organizing the arts and sciences into coherent bodies of tradition that could be transmitted to future generations through structured processes of education and initiation. The development of the list form as a fundamental genre of Mesopotamian intellectual production, which would subsequently generate the elaborate lexical, omen and catalogue texts that modern scholars have recovered in such abundance, represented one dimension of this systematizing impulse. The lists of gods, the catalogues of stars, the compendiums of omens, and the lexical series that organized Sumerian and Akkadian vocabulary into teachable sequences all reflected an underlying commitment to comprehensive documentation that the traditions traced ultimately to the systematic instruction of the antediluvian sages. The seventh and final sage, Utwabzu, occupied a position of particular complexity within the tradition as the last of the primordial instructors and the figure whose teaching immediately preceded the transformative catastrophe of the flood. The texts described Utwabzu as having ascended to heaven rather than dying in the manner of mortals, a detail that distinguished him from his predecessors and suggested a special closeness to the divine realm from which all the sages ultimately derived their wisdom. This ascension echoed other Mesopotamian traditions concerning figures who had crossed the boundary between mortal and immortal existence, including the flood hero Ziusudra or Utnapishtim, who had been granted eternal life by the gods in recognition of his preservation of life through the deluge. The association of the final sage with ascension rather than death created a framework within which the wisdom tradition could be understood as continuing to exist in celestial form even after the direct instruction of humanity had ceased, maintaining a connection between the earthly preservation of traditional knowledge and its ultimate divine source. The pattern of 7 sages corresponding to 7 antediluvian kings established numerical and structural relationships that possess significance beyond simple enumeration, reflecting broader Mesopotamian conceptions of cosmic order in which the number 7 held special importance. The 7 planetary bodies known to Mesopotamian astronomy, the 7 winds, the 7-day week that Mesopotamian tradition bequeathed to subsequent civilizations, and various other septenary structures, all reflected an underlying cosmological principle that found expression in the organization of the sage tradition. The completion of the series with the 7th sage and the subsequent occurrence of the flood created a narrative of fulfilled purpose, suggesting that the full complement of necessary wisdom had been transmitted before the catastrophe that would separate the antediluvian from the post-diluvian world. The iconographic representation of the Apkallu in Mesopotamian art developed distinctive conventions that made these figures immediately recognizable within the visual vocabulary of ancient Near Eastern religious imagery. The most common representational form depicted the Apkallu as composite beings with human bodies and the heads of fish, reflecting the aquatic origins emphasized in the textual traditions and the association of these figures with the watery domain of Enki. The fish head was typically shown as a kind of hood or cape draped over a human form, with the fish's body extending down the sage's back while the human face remained visible beneath the fish's open mouth. This iconographic convention represented the Apkallu as beings who participated simultaneously in aquatic and terrestrial natures, their fish garments symbolizing their emergence from the cosmic waters, while their human forms indicated their capacity to communicate with and instruct mortal audiences. Alternative iconographic traditions depicted the Apkallu in fully human form, but with distinctive attributes including elaborate ceremonial garments, specific poses, and characteristic objects that identified them as supernatural beings rather than ordinary mortals. These human form Apkallu typically appeared in context emphasizing their protective and purifying functions, particularly in architectural reliefs where they flanked doorways and passages as guardians against malevolent forces. The gestures and implements associated with these figures, including the bucket and cone combination that appeared repeatedly in Assyrian palace reliefs, indicated their role in rituals of purification and blessing that maintained the sacred quality of royal spaces. The bucket, typically identified as a bandudu containing purifying water or oil, and the cone, understood as a mululu or purifying implement, together represented the essential equipment of a apotropaic ritual that the Apkallu performed on behalf of the spaces and persons they protected. A third iconographic type depicted the Apkallu with bird features rather than fish characteristics, showing figures with human bodies but wings and sometimes bird heads or faces. These bird form Apkallu appeared most frequently in Assyrian palace contexts, where they formed part of elaborate programs of protective imagery that incorporated multiple supernatural beings in the guardianship of royal precincts. The relationship between the fish form and bird form representations remains somewhat unclear, with some scholars suggesting that they represented different categories of supernatural beings conflated under the general designation of Apkallu, while others proposed developmental or regional variation within a unified tradition. The presence of both forms in the same architectural contexts, sometimes in direct proximity, suggested that Assyrian religious thought recognized multiple manifestations of the sage concept rather than a single fixed form. The deployment of Apkallu imagery in architectural context reflected broader Mesopotamian practices of employing supernatural figures as protective presences within built environments, transforming physical structures into cosmically secured spaces through the installation of appropriate guardian beings. The palace reliefs of the Neo-Assyrian period, which provide the most abundant surviving evidence for Apkallu iconography, incorporated these figures within comprehensive programs that also included lamassu, the human-headed winged bulls or lions that guarded palace entrances, as well as various other supernatural beings and divine symbols. The systematic placement of Apkallu figures at doorways, in corridors, and within sacred precincts reflected ritual principles concerning the protection of liminal spaces, those transitional zones where movement between different areas created potential vulnerability to malevolent intrusion. The ritual texts that prescribe the installation of Apkallu figures and their associated protective installations reveal the theological principles that underlay their deployment in architectural contexts. The procedures described in these texts included specific incantations to be recited during installation, offerings to be made to the figures once positioned, and ongoing ritual attention required to maintain their protective efficacy. The figures were not understood as mere decorative elements or symbolic representations, but as actual presences that participated in the ongoing defense of the spaces they guarded, their effectiveness dependent upon proper ritual activation and maintenance. The burial of small figurines beneath doorways and at the corners of buildings extended this protective function below the visible surface, creating invisible networks of supernatural guardianship that complemented the visible imagery above ground. The relationship between the antediluvian Apkallu and the post-diluvian scholars, who claimed descent from or connection to their tradition, constituted one of the more complex aspects of the sage concept as it developed across Mesopotamian history. The texts distinguished clearly between the original 7 sages who had lived before the flood and the human scholars of subsequent periods who inherited and transmitted the wisdom the sages had revealed. Yet the boundaries between these categories could become fluid in certain contexts. Scholars of the historical period sometimes claimed identification with or descent from specific antediluvian sages, using these claims to assert special authority for their knowledge and practices. The title of Apkallu itself could be applied to living scholars of exceptional learning, suggesting that the sage concept encompassed both the original mythological figures and the human tradition bearers who maintained their legacy. The transmission of the wisdom the Apkallu had revealed depended upon institutional structures that preserved, reproduced, and extended traditional knowledge across generations, with the temple and palace establishments of major Mesopotamian cities serving as the primary locations for this ongoing process. The scribal schools associated with these institutions trained successive generations of scholars in the textual traditions that ultimately derived from antediluvian revelation, using curricula that emphasized the copying, memorization, and interpretation of canonical compositions. The colophons that scribes appended to their tablets sometimes traced the transmission history of particular texts, identifying the chain of scholars through whom a composition had passed, and occasionally extending that chain back to the original revelations of the antediluvian period. These transmission claims established the authority of text by connecting them to sources beyond human invention, positioning specific compositions as repositories of wisdom that humans could preserve and study but had not themselves created. The concept of the me, those fundamental powers and principles that governed all aspects of civilized existence, provided the theoretical framework within which the Apkallu's transmission of knowledge could be understood. The me encompassed everything from divine attributes and cosmic functions to practical arts and social institutions, representing the essential structures that made ordered existence possible. The mythological traditions concerning the me, particularly the composition known as Inanna and Enki, in which the goddess acquired the me from the god of wisdom through a combination of seduction and trickery, established that these powers were themselves objects of divine possession and manipulation, entities that could be transferred, acquired, or lost through divine action. The Apkallu's role as transmitters of the me to humanity positioned them as agents of a divine decision to share these essential powers with mortals, a decision that had transformed human existence from a state of primitive ignorance to one of civilized capability. The tablets and ritual objects that Mesopotamian tradition associated with the Apkallu served as physical embodiments of the knowledge they had transmitted, providing tangible connections to the antediluvian revelation that subsequent generations could preserve and consult. The reference to tablets that had been written before the flood and survived the deluge to be recovered and studied by post-diluvian scholars appeared in several Mesopotamian contexts, establishing a material continuity between antediluvian wisdom and historical tradition. The Sumerian king list and related historiographic compositions recorded the transmission of kingship across the flood boundary, providing a model for understanding how other institutions and bodies of knowledge had similarly survived the catastrophe to be reconstituted in the post-diluvian world. The flood itself, while representing a fundamental rupture in cosmic history, had not entirely severed the connection between the antediluvian and post-diluvian periods, with specific mechanisms including the preservation of tablets, the survival of the flood hero, and the continued existence of temples and their traditions ensuring some degree of continuity. The integration of the Apkallu tradition into the broader framework of Mesopotamian mythology required reconciliation with other accounts of how humans had acquired knowledge and culture, including traditions that attributed various arts to different divine inventors or discoverers. The attribution of writing to the god Nabu, of crafts to various divine patrons, and of specific techniques to legendary human inventors coexisted with the Apkallu tradition rather than directly contradicting it, with the different accounts operating at different levels of explanation or applying to different aspects of the relevant knowledge. The Apkallu could be understood as the mediators through whom divine knowledge had first reached humanity without necessarily being the ultimate inventors of that knowledge, which remained the possession of the gods who had created and controlled all things. This layered structure of attribution, in which multiple agents participated in the transmission of knowledge from divine sources to human recipients, reflected the general complexity of Mesopotamian religious thought, which rarely reduced explanations to single causes when multiple factors could be acknowledged. The ritual applications of the Apkallu tradition extended beyond the protective functions evident in architectural contexts to encompass therapeutic and purificatory procedures in which the sages were invoked as paradigmatic practitioners of the arts being performed. The incantations recited during healing rituals frequently identified the human practitioner as acting in the name or manner of divine or semi-divine predecessors, with the Apkallu sometimes appearing among the august figures whose authority legitimated the ritual action. The exorcist performing a purification, the physician administering a treatment, or the diviner interpreting an omen could each claim connection to traditions ultimately derived from antediluvian revelation. positioning their individual acts of ritual expertise within a framework of cosmic significance that extended back to the origins of civilized knowledge. The efficacy of ritual action depended in part upon this connection to authoritative precedent, with procedures that could trace their origins to divinely revealed sources possessing greater power than innovations lacking such pedigrees. The transmission of ritual knowledge from antediluvian sources to historical practitioners involved not merely the preservation of techniques and procedures, but also the maintenance of the conceptual frameworks within which those techniques operated and through which their efficacy was understood. The Apkallu tradition provided one such framework, situating the diverse arts of Mesopotamian religious practice within a unified narrative of divine revelation and human reception that connected the activities of temple personnel in historical cities to the primordial acts of transmission that had established civilized existence. The scholars who maintained and transmitted the cuneiform tradition in Babylonia and Assyria understood themselves as heirs to this antediluvian legacy, with their mastery of ancient texts and archaic scripts serving as evidence of their participation in the continuous chain of transmission that linked them to the original sages. The colophons appended to scholarly tablets sometimes invoked this connection explicitly, identifying the texts as copies of ancient originals that derived ultimately from antediluvian sources, while the scholars who produced these copies positioned themselves as faithful preservers of knowledge whose origins predated the flood itself. The institution of apprenticeship through which scribal and ritual knowledge was transmitted replicated in miniature the original transmission from Apkallu to humanity, with master practitioners serving as conduits for wisdom that exceeded their individual understanding and connected their students to traditions of cosmic antiquity. The father-son terminology employed in Mesopotamian educational and professional contexts, where master craftsmen and scholars referred to their apprentices as sons and were addressed as fathers regardless of biological relationship, reflected this understanding of knowledge transmission as a form of genealogical descent in which wisdom passed from generation to generation through relationships of instruction and imitation. The Apkallu themselves could be understood within this framework as the ultimate fathers of all practitioners of the civilized arts, the ancestral figures from whom all subsequent generations of craftsmen, scholars, and ritual specialists derived their capabilities. The reverence accorded to ancient texts and the authority attributed to archaic formulations reflected this sense of connection to primordial sources, with the antiquity of a tradition serving as evidence of its reliability and power. The relationship between the Apkallu and the institution of kingship represented another dimension of the tradition's significance, positioning the divine sages as the ultimate sources of the knowledge that enabled effective royal governance. The Sumerian and Akkadian lists of kings that traced monarchical succession across millennia included references to the antediluvian period and the rulers who had reigned before the flood, establishing kingship itself as an institution that had existed from the earliest phases of human civilization and had been transmitted across the catastrophic rupture of the deluge. The Apkallu, as counselors and instructors who had advised these antediluvian kings while simultaneously transmitting the arts of civilization to humanity generally, occupied a position adjacent to royal power without themselves being kings, serving as the wise advisors whose guidance had enabled the proper exercise of monarchical authority. This pattern of sage advising king, of wisdom serving power, established a template for the relationship between learned specialists and royal patrons that would characterize Mesopotamian civilization throughout its historical development. The kings of historical Mesopotamia surrounded themselves with scholars, diviners, and ritual specialists whose expertise enabled the proper performance of royal duties and whose counsel informed the decisions of state. The training of princes included not only military preparation and administrative instruction, but also initiation into bodies of traditional knowledge that derived from antediluvian revelation, with royal education serving as a continuation of the original transmission that the Apkallu had effected in the earliest period of human civilization. The association of specific kings with the pursuit and patronage of learning reflected this understanding of wisdom as essential to proper governance, with rulers like Ashurbanipal of Assyria boasting of their scholarly accomplishments and their mastery of ancient texts as evidence of their fitness to rule. The great library that Ashurbanipal assembled at Nineveh, containing copies of the major works of Mesopotamian literature, scholarship, and ritual tradition, represented an attempt to gather and preserve the heritage of antediluvian wisdom, creating a repository of knowledge that could serve as a resource for the king and his scholarly advisors in perpetuity. The physical representation of the Apkallu in monumental art created visual statements about royal power and its relationship to divine wisdom that complemented the textual traditions concerning the sages. The carved reliefs that decorated the palaces of Assyrian kings depicted the apotropaic figures in prominent positions, flanking doorways and lining corridors through which the king and his court passed daily, creating an environment saturated with protective imagery derived from antediluvian tradition. The positioning of these figures at thresholds and boundaries reflected their liminal nature as beings who mediated between realms, protecting the spaces within from threats originating beyond, while simultaneously ensuring the proper flow of beneficial influences across the boundaries they guarded. The king who moved through palace spaces thus passed continuously under the protection of figures associated with the primordial transmission of civilization, their presence serving as a constant reminder of the cosmic dimensions of royal power and the ultimate sources from which that power derived. The iconographic vocabulary employed in depicting the Apkallu encoded information about their nature and function that viewers familiar with Mesopotamian visual conventions could read and interpret. The bucket and cone held by the figures represented implements of purification and blessing, whose specific ritual applications were known to the scholars and priests who served at court, while the composite forms combining human and animal elements signalled the extraordinary nature of beings who transcended ordinary categories. The fish-cloaked figures with human bodies emerging from fish garments particularly emphasised the aquatic origins of the Apkallu and their association with the waters of the Apsu, the subterranean freshwater ocean from which wisdom was understood to derive. The visual program of the Assyrian palaces thus created a coherent symbolic environment in which the diverse elements of the Apkallu tradition were synthesized into a unified statement about royal power, divine protection, and the cosmic significance of the Mesopotamian monarchy. The ritual procedures accompanying the installation and consecration of the Apkallu figures transformed their placement from mere decoration into acts of religious significance that activated their protective powers and established their ritual efficacy. The mouth-washing and mouth-opening ceremonies performed on statues and reliefs prepared them to function as focal points for divine presence, with the consecration procedures purifying the images from the contamination of their earthly manufacture and enabling them to serve as vehicles for supernatural power. The craftsmen who had carved the figures from stone or shaped them from clay were ritually rejected during these ceremonies, their human involvement denied as the figures were proclaimed to have descended from heaven or emerged from the sacred groves, their origin attributed entirely to divine rather than human agency. The Apkallu images, once consecrated through these procedures, became active participants in the ongoing work of protection and purification that maintained cosmic order, their presence contributing to the stability and prosperity of the households and institutions they guarded. The mythological traditions concerning the Apkallu intersected with broader Mesopotamian cosmogonic narratives that explained the origins of the universe, the gods, and humanity in terms of primordial conflicts and creative acts. The great creation epic Enuma Elish, which recounted the victory of Marduk over the chaotic waters personified by Tiamat and his subsequent organization of the cosmos, established the framework within which all subsequent divine and human action took place, with the defeat of primordial chaos creating the conditions for ordered existence. The Apkallu tradition could be understood within this framework as describing one phase in the ongoing work of cosmic organization, a phase in which the establishment of human civilization extended the principles of order from the divine and cosmic realms into the human sphere. The transmission of the me and the arts of civilization represented a continuation of Marduk's creative work, bringing the structures of order that characterized divine existence into human life, and enabling mortals to participate in the maintenance of cosmic stability. The flood that concluded the antediluvian period could similarly be understood within cosmogonic frameworks as a temporary reassertion of the primordial chaos that creation had originally subdued, a regression to conditions resembling the watery, undifferentiated state that had preceded cosmic organization. The waters that covered the earth during the deluge represented a return of Tiamat, a dissolution of the boundaries and distinctions that defined ordered existence, while the recession of the flood and the restoration of normal conditions marked a renewal of the creative work that had originally established the cosmos. The survival of the flood hero and the preservation of the essential knowledge and traditions of civilization across the deluge ensured that the restoration was not a new creation, but a reconstitution, with the post-Diluvian world inheriting from its antediluvian predecessor the achievements that the Apkallu had originally transmitted. The flood thus functioned within Mesopotamian mythological thought as both rupture and connection, severing the world that existed before from the world that followed, while simultaneously maintaining the essential continuities that defined civilized existence. The traditions concerning what had been preserved across the flood boundary and how that preservation had been accomplished varied in their details while agreeing on the fundamental principle that antediluvian wisdom had survived to inform post-diluvian practice. Some accounts emphasize the role of the flood hero, known variously as Zeusudra, Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim depending on the tradition, in preserving tablets or instructions that could serve as the foundation for reconstructing civilization after the waters receded. Other traditions focused on the continuation of specific institutions, particularly temples and their associated cults, whose foundation in the antediluvian period and survival through the flood established their claims to antiquity and authority. The traditions concerning tablets written before the flood and discovered or recovered in the post-diluvian period by kings and scholars seeking to restore ancient knowledge provided another mechanism for transmission, with these tablets serving as material links to antediluvian revelation. The search for antediluvian tablets and the claim to have discovered them appeared in several royal inscriptions, with Mesopotamian kings presenting themselves as restorers of ancient knowledge and revivers of traditions that had been lost or obscured through the passage of time. The inscriptions of Ashurbanipal describe the king's ability to read inscriptions from before the flood, a claim that positioned him as a figure of exceptional scholarly capability, while simultaneously asserting the survival of antediluvian textual traditions into the present. The possession of such ancient knowledge enhanced royal authority by connecting the king to the primordial sources of wisdom, making him an heir to the Apkallu themselves and a participant in the ongoing transmission of civilizing knowledge. Whether these claims reflected actual discoveries of unusually ancient tablets or represented conventional assertions of royal wisdom that employed the antediluvian past as a rhetorical resource, they demonstrated the continued significance of the Apkallu tradition and the antediluvian period for Mesopotamian understandings of knowledge, authority, and civilization. The relationship between the Apkallu tradition and the broader phenomenon of Mesopotamian wisdom literature reveals additional dimensions of how the sages were understood and their significance conceptualized. The category of wisdom literature in Mesopotamian textual production encompassed diverse compositions including proverbs, didactic poetry, dialogue texts exploring philosophical questions, and practical advice for navigating social and professional life. The attribution of such compositions to ancient sages, while not always explicitly connecting them to the Apkallu specifically, reflected a general understanding that wisdom derived from ancient sources and that the instructions of predecessors provided guidance superior to individual innovation or contemporary discovery. The figure of the wise counselor, knowledgeable in ancient traditions and capable of providing sound advice to those who sought guidance, embodied virtues that the Apkallu tradition portrayed as having cosmic origins and antediluvian precedents. The Akkadian dialogue known as the Dialogue of Pessimism, in which a master and servant engage in philosophical conversation about the value of various human activities, exemplified the questioning and reflective dimensions of Mesopotamian wisdom literature that explored fundamental questions about human existence and its meaning. While not directly invoking the Apkallu tradition, such compositions participated in the broader culture of reflection and inquiry that the transmission of civilization had made possible, representing the ongoing exercise of the intellectual capabilities that divine revelation had originally bestowed. The pessimistic or skeptical conclusions that some wisdom texts reached concerning human striving and divine justice did not contradict the fundamental premises of the Apkallu tradition, but rather represented one dimension of the sophisticated intellectual culture that antediluvian revelation had enabled. The ability to question, to doubt, and to explore alternatives was itself a civilized capability that distinguished humans who had received the arts of civilization from the primitive beings who had existed before that transmission. The influence of Mesopotamian traditions concerning antediluvian sages and the flood extended beyond the cuneiform world to affect the literary and religious traditions of neighbouring cultures, most notably the biblical and later Jewish traditions that would carry elements of this mythological complex into the foundations of Western religious thought. The figure of Enoch in the Hebrew biblical tradition and in the extensive apocalyptic literature associated with his name bore striking resemblances to elements of the Apkallu tradition, while the biblical flood narrative preserved in the Book of Genesis drew upon Mesopotamian antecedents that included not only the story of the deluge itself, but also the broader framework of antediluvian wisdom and its transmission. The 7 antediluvian patriarchs of some Jewish traditions, corresponding numerically to the 7 Apkallu, suggested the possibility of direct influence or parallel development of traditions concerning the privileged figures of the period before the flood. The Book of Watchers, an early section of the composite work known as 1 Enoch, presented an account of antediluvian events that included the descent of heavenly beings to earth and their transmission of various forms of knowledge to humanity, a narrative that shared fundamental structures with the Apkallu tradition while developing these elements in distinctively Jewish directions. The watchers of this tradition were angels who had abandoned their heavenly stations to cohabit with human women, producing offspring of giants while also teaching humans various arts, including metallurgy, cosmetics, astrology, and other forms of knowledge. Unlike the Apkallu, whose transmission of civilization was presented positively as fulfilling divine purpose, the Watcher's revelation was portrayed as transgressive, a disclosure of secrets that should have remained hidden and that contributed to the corruption requiring the flood as punishment. The parallel structure of antediluvian transmission leading to catastrophic flood appeared in both traditions, though the evaluation of the transmission differed fundamentally, with Mesopotamian tradition celebrating what Jewish tradition condemned. The complexity of the relationship between these traditions reflected the broader cultural exchanges that characterized the ancient Near East, where ideas, narratives, and religious concepts circulated among diverse peoples, while being transformed and reinterpreted according to the distinctive concerns and perspectives of each receiving tradition. The Israelites, who had contact with Mesopotamian culture during periods of political domination and exile, encountered traditions concerning antediluvian sages and the flood that resonated with elements of their own ancestral narratives, while differing in crucial respects, and the literary and religious products of this encounter bore the marks of both appropriation and rejection. The transformation of Mesopotamian materials in Jewish contexts represented not simple borrowing, but creative engagement, with elements extracted from their original frameworks and integrated into new configurations that served the theological purposes of the receiving tradition. The post-exilic development of Jewish apocalyptic literature drew extensively upon Mesopotamian materials while subordinating them to distinctively Jewish concerns with monotheism, divine justice, and the ultimate fate of the righteous and wicked. The figure of Enoch, who in the brief biblical notice had walked with God and was taken without experiencing death, became the recipient and revealer of cosmic secrets whose scope exceeded anything attributed to the Apkallu, encompassing the structure of the heavens, the courses of celestial bodies, the judgments awaiting souls after death, and the ultimate disposition of history. The transformation of Enoch from obscure antediluvian patriarch to central apocalyptic figure reflected the productive potential of the tradition concerning antediluvian wisdom, which provided a framework capable of indefinite expansion, as new revelatory content was attributed to the primordial sage. The Enochic literature also developed traditions concerning the punishment of the Watchers and the binding of their leader Azazel that had no parallel in the Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition, incorporating elements of demonology and theodicy that reflected distinctively Jewish theological concerns. The fallen angels became explanatory figures for the origin of evil and suffering, their primordial transgression accounting for the corrupted state of the world in ways that the straightforwardly positive Apkallu tradition did not attempt. The cosmic conflict between good and evil that structured much of Jewish apocalyptic thought required figures who embodied the negative pole of that conflict, and the transformed Watchers provided such figures while simultaneously explaining how humans had acquired forms of knowledge that could be used for harmful purposes. The ambivalence towards civilization and its arts that characterized some strands of Jewish and later Christian thought thus found mythological expression in the negative portrayal of the Watchers, contrasting sharply with the Mesopotamian celebration of the Apkallu as benefactors of humanity. The Greek world encountered Mesopotamian traditions concerning primordial sages through channels that differed from those available to the Israelites, and the resulting transformations followed paths shaped by distinctively Hellenic, philosophical and religious concerns. The figure of Oannes, preserved in Berossus's account of Babylonian history written in the early 3rd century BC for Greek audiences, represented the most direct transmission of Apkallu traditions to the Mediterranean world. Though the transformation that occurred in this transmission revealed the challenges of translating concepts between fundamentally different cultural frameworks. Berossus himself, a priest of Marduk in Babylon who had witnessed the conquest of the city by Alexander's armies and the establishment of Macedonian rule over the ancient Near East, occupied a position uniquely suited to mediate between Mesopotamian and Greek intellectual traditions, and his Babylonica represented an attempt to make Babylonian history and culture intelligible to Greek readers, while simultaneously asserting the antiquity and sophistication of Mesopotamian civilization against Greek claims to cultural superiority. The work, surviving only in fragments preserved by later authors who quoted or summarized portions of it, presented Oannes as a being who emerged from the sea in the first year of recorded Babylonian history, possessing a body that combined fish and human features and bearing knowledge that would transform human existence. The description that Berossus provided drew upon the visual iconography, familiar from millennia of Mesopotamian artistic tradition, where figures wearing fish cloaks or possessing composite fish-human forms had represented the Apkallu in countless ritual contexts, though the translation of this imagery into Greek prose inevitably altered its significance and effect. Greek readers encountering Berossus's account would have approached it through interpretive frameworks shaped by their own mythological and philosophical traditions, potentially assimilating Oannes to familiar categories of sea deities, culture heroes, or philosophical teachers while missing the specifically Mesopotamian associations that had given the Apkallu their meaning within their original context. The philosophical dimensions of the Apkallu tradition underwent particular transformation as Mesopotamian ideas circulated within Hellenistic intellectual culture. The Greek philosophical tradition had developed its own concepts of primordial wisdom and divine revelation, from the inspired madness of poets and prophets to the rational contemplation of eternal truths that Plato had described as the highest human activity, and these frameworks provided the interpretive lenses through which Greek thinkers would approach reports of Mesopotamian sage traditions. The Pythagorean movement, with its combination of philosophical inquiry, religious practice, and claims to possess secret wisdom transmitted from ancient sources, represented one context within which Mesopotamian materials concerning primordial revelation might find reception, though the specific channels through which such influence might have operated remained largely obscure. Later, Neoplatonic philosophers would develop elaborate systems incorporating elements from diverse ancient traditions, including materials of ultimately Mesopotamian origin that had passed through multiple intermediary stages before reaching their final formulations, though distinguishing the Mesopotamian elements within these synthetic systems required careful analysis that modern scholars continued to debate. The concept of a golden age of primordial knowledge followed by decline, which appeared in various forms throughout Greek philosophical and religious thought, resonated with the Mesopotamian understanding of the Apkallu as bearers of complete wisdom that subsequent generations could only partially recover, though the specific contents attributed to this primordial wisdom differed considerably between the two traditions. The Hermetic literature, a body of texts claiming to preserve the teachings of Hermes Trismegistus and composed primarily in Egypt during the early centuries of the Common Era, represented another context within which traditions of primordial revelation circulated and transformed. The figure of Hermes Trismegistus himself was a syncretic creation combining elements of the Greek god Hermes with the Egyptian god Thoth, and the literature attributed to him claimed to transmit ancient Egyptian wisdom, while incorporating elements from Greek philosophy, Jewish speculation, and other sources within the cosmopolitan intellectual environment of Roman Egypt. The structural parallels between Hermetic claims and the Apkallu tradition were evident, both involving the transmission of sacred knowledge from divine or semi-divine sources to humanity in the distant past, though direct influence from Mesopotamian sources upon the Hermetic literature remained difficult to demonstrate given the multiple intermediary traditions through which such influence would have had to pass. The general pattern of primordial revelation, however, represented a type of religious claim that transcended any single cultural tradition, appearing independently in diverse contexts as communities sought to ground their knowledge and practices in foundations that preceded ordinary human history and derived from sources beyond ordinary human capacity. The Apkallu tradition represented the Mesopotamian exemplification of this widespread pattern, shaped by the specific cultural, religious, and historical circumstances of Sumerian and Babylonian civilization, while participating in broader human tendencies to locate ultimate authority in primordial revelation rather than contemporary innovation. The transmission of Mesopotamian astronomical knowledge to the Greek world provided a more concrete and traceable channel of influence than the murky paths through which mythological traditions might have travelled. Greek astronomers of the Hellenistic period explicitly acknowledged their debt to Babylonian observations and methods, and the precision of Babylonian astronomical records, maintained over centuries by temple institutions that traced their practices to the primordial sages, contributed essential data to the development of Greek astronomical theory. Hipparchus, the 2nd century BC astronomer whose work established many of the foundations of later Greek and eventually European astronomy, explicitly drew upon Babylonian eclipse records and other observations in developing his calculations, and the lunar and planetary theories that Ptolemy would later systematize in his Almagest incorporated Babylonian elements that ultimately derived from the scholarly traditions maintained by priests who understood themselves as heirs to the Apkallu. The practical transmission of astronomical knowledge thus occurred through concrete institutional channels, with Greek scholars gaining access to Babylonian records and methods through the cultural contacts that Alexander's conquests had facilitated, even as the mythological framework within which Babylonians had understood the divine origin of this knowledge failed to travel intact. The Greeks received the astronomy without receiving the full theological context that had explained its ultimate derivation from the antediluvian sages, a pattern of selective transmission that characterized much of the cultural exchange between Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean world. The astrological traditions that developed in the Hellenistic world represented another domain within which Mesopotamian influence proved both substantial and enduring. Babylonian celestial omens, systematized in the great series Enuma Anu Enlil and attributed ultimately to the revealed wisdom of the sages, provided foundational materials for the development of horoscopic astrology in the Hellenistic period, a new synthesis that combined Babylonian omen traditions with Greek astronomical theory and Egyptian calendrical practices. The resulting system, which would dominate Western astrological thought for nearly 2 millennia, bore the marks of its Mesopotamian ancestry in its fundamental categories and interpretive principles, even as it transformed these elements through integration with Greek philosophical concepts and was eventually transmitted to later civilizations without explicit acknowledgement of its Mesopotamian origins. The Apkallu, whose revelation had included the interpretation of celestial phenomena among its essential contents, thus indirectly shaped intellectual practices that would continue long after their names had been forgotten, and the cuneiform tablets preserving their traditions had crumbled into illegibility. The Roman world inherited Greek representations of Mesopotamian traditions, while adding layers of further transformation that reflected distinctively Roman concerns with ancient wisdom and civilized order. Roman intellectuals, aware that their own civilization was relatively young compared to the ancient cultures of the East, showed considerable interest in reports concerning the antiquity and sophistication of Babylonian, Egyptian, and other Oriental traditions, even as they frequently subordinated such interest to assertions of Roman superiority in practical affairs and moral virtue. Berossus's work continued to be quoted and summarized by Latin authors, preserving the account of Owans and the antediluvian sages within the literary tradition of the Roman world, though the interpretive frameworks through which Roman readers approached such materials differed from both the original Mesopotamian context and the Greek philosophical frameworks that had first received them. The general Roman attitude toward ancient wisdom combined respect for antiquity with skepticism toward claims that could not be verified, and preference for practical utility over speculative elaboration, characteristics that shaped the reception of traditions concerning primordial revelation in directions different from those that Greek philosophical circles had pursued. The early Christian movement emerged within this complex environment of circulating traditions concerning ancient wisdom, divine revelation, and cosmic history, and its responses to these traditions shaped the subsequent development of Western thought concerning primordial knowledge and its transmission. Christian writers engaged with Jewish apocalyptic traditions, including the Enochic literature, with Greek philosophical claims concerning wisdom and divine knowledge, and with various Oriental traditions that circulated within the cosmopolitan environment of the Roman Empire, developing distinctively Christian positions that both appropriated and rejected elements of these diverse sources. The early chapters of Genesis, which Christian communities shared with Jewish tradition, provided the scriptural foundation for understanding antediluvian history, and Christian interpreters developed their readings of these passages in dialogue with both Jewish exegetical traditions and the broader cultural environment within which multiple traditions concerning primordial events competed for attention and authority. The figure of Enoch, whose role in Jewish apocalyptic literature had expanded far beyond the brief biblical notice, received varied treatment in Christian circles, with some communities accepting and transmitting Enochic texts, while others rejected them as inauthentic or dangerous, and the status of claims concerning antediluvian revelation remained contested throughout the early centuries of Christian development. The concept of the Nephilim, mentioned briefly in Genesis, as existing in the days before the flood, and identified in some traditions as the offspring of unions between the sons of God and daughters of men, became a focus of considerable speculation in both Jewish and Christian contexts, with interpretations drawing upon and transforming earlier traditions concerning antediluvian beings of extraordinary nature. The Christian reception of traditions concerning fallen angels incorporated elements from Jewish apocalyptic sources while developing these materials in directions shaped by distinctively Christian theological concerns, including the understanding of cosmic evil, the nature and activity of demons, and the ultimate fate of rebellious spiritual beings. The negative valuation of antediluvian revelation that characterized the Watcher traditions, where the transmission of knowledge appeared as transgression, deserving punishment rather than benefit worthy of gratitude, persisted and intensified in much Christian thought, contributing to ambivalent attitudes towards certain forms of knowledge that would characterize Christian intellectual history for centuries. The contrast with the positive Mesopotamian evaluation of the Apkallu as divinely commissioned benefactors could hardly have been sharper, revealing how similar structural elements concerning antediluvian transmission could serve diametrically opposed theological purposes depending on the evaluative frameworks within which they were embedded. The Gnostic movements of the early centuries of the Common Era developed elaborate mythological systems that incorporated and transformed elements from diverse ancient traditions, including materials that may have derived ultimately from Mesopotamian sources, though transmitted through multiple intermediary stages that obscured their origins. Gnostic cosmologies frequently featured hierarchies of spiritual beings, revelations of hidden knowledge, and narratives of primordial events that explained the present condition of the world and the path to salvation. Structural features that resonated with patterns found in Mesopotamian tradition, though integrated into frameworks shaped by distinctively Gnostic concerns with the evil nature of the material world and the entrapment of divine sparks within mortal flesh. The figure of the revealer who descends from higher realms to transmit saving knowledge to those capable of receiving it appeared throughout Gnostic literature in various forms, and while the Apkallu themselves did not appear explicitly in these texts, the general pattern of divine beings transmitting transformative knowledge to humanity represented a type that the Apkallu tradition had exemplified within its own cultural context. The Gnostic emphasis on secret knowledge restricted to initiates also echoed aspects of the Mesopotamian tradition concerning the sages, where the wisdom revealed to Adapa and transmitted through succeeding Apkallu was preserved within scribal and priestly institutions that controlled access to its most esoteric elements. The Islamic civilization that emerged in the 7th century and expanded rapidly across the ancient Near East, North Africa and beyond, inherited and transformed elements from multiple earlier traditions concerning ancient wisdom and its transmission. The city of Baghdad, founded in the 8th century as the capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, was constructed near the ruins of ancient Babylon, and the scholars who gathered there engaged with both the material and intellectual remains of Mesopotamian civilization. Though the cuneiform script had long since ceased to be understood, and the specific contents of Mesopotamian tradition were accessible only through intermediary sources in Greek, Syriac and other languages. The translation movement that flourished in Baghdad during the 9th and 10th centuries brought Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic, including materials that incorporated or referenced Mesopotamian elements, and Islamic scholars developed their own frameworks for understanding ancient wisdom and its relationship to the revelation transmitted through the Prophet Muhammad. The concept of prophets sent by God to guide humanity throughout history provided an Islamic framework within which figures from earlier traditions might be understood, and certain pre-Islamic sages were incorporated into Islamic sacred history as prophets or wise men whose knowledge had derived from divine guidance. The specific figures of the Apkallu, however, remained unknown within Islamic tradition, their names and distinctive characteristics having been lost during the long centuries of cultural transformation that separated the cuneiform scribes from the scholars of the Islamic Golden Age. The fragmentary preservation of Mesopotamian traditions within later cultures thus followed patterns shaped by the specific mechanisms of transmission and the selective interests of receiving communities. Certain elements proved capable of travelling across cultural boundaries, while others remained bound to their original contexts and disappeared when those contexts ceased to exist. The astronomical and astrological knowledge that the Apkallu tradition had attributed to primordial revelation proved most transmissible, carried forward through practical institutional channels that valued the utility of the knowledge regardless of the mythological frameworks that had originally explained its origin. The mythological narratives themselves survived more fragmentarily, with figures like Oannes preserved in Greek sources while other Apkallu vanished from memory, and the theological significance attributed to these figures in their original context gave way to diverse reinterpretations shaped by the concerns of later traditions. The fate of the Apkallu tradition illustrated broader patterns in cultural transmission, where complete systems of thought rarely survived intact, but elements extracted from their original context could achieve new lives within different frameworks, transformed in ways that might have surprised and possibly troubled those who had first formulated and preserved them. The medieval European reception of classical and Oriental traditions concerning ancient wisdom operated through channels that further distanced the resulting ideas from their Mesopotamian origins. The limited portions of classical literature that survived the collapse of the Roman West and remained accessible throughout the medieval period included some references to Babylonian and Oriental wisdom, but these fragmentary notices provided little basis for reconstructing the systematic traditions that had once flourished in Mesopotamia. The rediscovery of classical learning during the Renaissance brought renewed interest in ancient wisdom traditions, including those attributed to Egypt, Babylon, and other Oriental civilizations, though the sources available to Renaissance scholars preserved only distorted echoes of the original Mesopotamian content. The Renaissance fascination with ancient wisdom manifested most prominently in the revival of Hermetic literature, a body of texts attributed to the legendary Egyptian sage Hermes Trismegistus, whose purported antiquity had convinced many scholars that it represented the oldest stratum of human knowledge, predating even Moses and the Hebrew scriptures. The Hermetic texts, which modern scholarship would eventually demonstrate to have been composed during the early centuries of the Common Era rather than in the remotest antiquity, presented a philosophical and mystical system that incorporated elements from Greek, Egyptian, and perhaps indirectly Mesopotamian sources, though the specific contributions of Mesopotamian tradition remained difficult to isolate from the syncretic mixture. The Florentine philosopher Marsilio Ficino, whose translation of the Hermetic corpus into Latin during the 1460s helped inaugurate the Renaissance revival of ancient theology, believed that he was recovering primordial wisdom that had been revealed to humanity in the earliest ages, and subsequently transmitted through a succession of sages that included Zoroaster, Orpheus, Pythagoras, and Plato. This concept of the Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology that had been known to the earliest humans and preserved through chains of initiated teachers, provided a framework within which Renaissance thinkers could understand the diversity of ancient religious and philosophical traditions as fragmentary preservations of an original unity. The structural parallels between this Renaissance framework and the Mesopotamian tradition concerning the Apkallu were significant, though Renaissance scholars lacked direct access to the cuneiform sources that would have revealed these connections. Both traditions posited an original moment of revelation when divine or semi-divine beings had transmitted comprehensive knowledge to humanity, and both understood subsequent human wisdom as deriving from this primordial bestowal rather than from gradual discovery or independent invention. The Renaissance concept of a golden age of wisdom followed by gradual decline, and the possibility of recovery through study of ancient sources, echoed the Mesopotamian understanding of the antediluvian period as a time of perfect knowledge whose transmission through the flood had established the foundations of all subsequent civilization. Yet the specific content of Mesopotamian tradition, the names and characteristics of the Apkallu, the details of their revelations, and the mythological narratives within which they had figured remained inaccessible to Renaissance scholars, who instead drew upon the distorted and fragmentary echoes preserved in Greek, Latin, and medieval sources. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed the beginning of scholarly efforts to recover the lost civilizations of the ancient Near East, though progress remained slow until the 19th century breakthrough of cuneiform decipherment. European travellers and diplomats who visited the Ottoman territories that encompassed the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia brought back reports of inscribed bricks, sculptured reliefs, and monumental remains that testified to the existence of once great civilizations whose history and culture remained largely unknown. The development of comparative philology and the systematic study of ancient inscriptions created the methodological foundations for decipherment, while the geopolitical interests of European powers in the Near East provided institutional support for archaeological expeditions that would eventually uncover the physical remains of Mesopotamian civilization on a massive scale. The discovery of the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh during excavations conducted by Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam in the 1850s brought to light thousands of cuneiform tablets whose contents, once deciphered, would transform understanding of ancient Near Eastern history, literature, and religion. The process of decipherment proceeded gradually during the middle decades of the 19th century, with scholars including Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and Jules Oppert contributing to the recovery of Akkadian and Sumerian languages from the bilingual and trilingual inscriptions that provided the key to understanding the cuneiform writing system. The successful reading of cuneiform texts revealed for the first time the actual contents of Mesopotamian literature and religion, including the mythological narratives concerning the creation of the world, the Great Flood, and the role of divine and semi-divine beings in transmitting civilization to humanity. The publication of George Smith's Chaldean account of Genesis in 1876, which presented translations of the Babylonian flood narrative discovered among the Nineveh tablets, created a public sensation by demonstrating the existence of Mesopotamian parallels to biblical narratives that had previously been understood as unique revelations. The scholarly investigation of these parallels generated intense debate concerning the relationship between Mesopotamian and biblical traditions, with some interpreters arguing for direct Mesopotamian influence on Hebrew scriptures, while others defended the independent authority of biblical revelation. The Apkallu tradition emerged from obscurity during this period of discovery and interpretation, as scholars pieced together references from various cuneiform sources to reconstruct the Mesopotamian understanding of the primordial sages and their role in transmitting civilization. The identification of the fish-cloaked figures depicted in Assyrian palace reliefs as representations of the Apkallu provided visual evidence that complemented the textual sources, demonstrating the continued importance of these figures within Mesopotamian religion and royal ideology throughout the first millennium BCE. The recognition that Berossus's account of Oannes and subsequent fishmen represented a version of the much older Apkallu tradition allowed scholars to trace the continuity of this tradition across millennia and to understand the processes by which Mesopotamian concepts had been transmitted to the Greek-speaking world. The publication of increasingly complete translations of cuneiform sources during the late 19th and early 20th centuries provided the basis for systematic study of Mesopotamian religion and mythology, including the traditions concerning the Apkallu that had been preserved in texts ranging from lexical lists and ritual instructions to epic narratives and royal inscriptions. The integration of recovered Mesopotamian traditions into broader scholarly frameworks for understanding ancient religion and the history of civilization proceeded through several distinct phases. The initial period of discovery and decipherment, extending roughly from the 1850s through the early 20th century, was characterized by the excitement of recovering lost worlds and the tendency to interpret newly discovered materials through familiar biblical and classical frameworks. The Pan-Babylonian school that flourished in Germany during the late 19th and early 20th centuries represented an extreme version of this tendency, arguing that Mesopotamian astral mythology had provided the foundation for religious traditions throughout the ancient world, and that biblical narratives could be understood as transformations of Babylonian originals. The exaggerated claims of the Pan-Babylonians generated scholarly reaction that emphasized the distinctiveness of individual ancient cultures and cautioned against assuming direct influence where parallel development might provide sufficient explanation. The maturation of Assyriology as an academic discipline during the 20th century brought more nuanced approaches to the study of Mesopotamian traditions and their relationships to other ancient cultures. Scholars, including Benno Landsberger, Thorkild Jakobsen, and Samuel Noah Kramer, developed sophisticated methodologies for interpreting cuneiform sources within their own cultural contexts, while also tracing patterns of influence and transmission across cultural boundaries. The Apkallu tradition received sustained scholarly attention within this framework, with researchers investigating the evolution of the tradition across different periods and genres of Mesopotamian literature, the relationship between the Apkallu and other categories of supernatural beings, and the ritual and ideological functions that the tradition had served within Mesopotamian society. The publication of comprehensive treatments of Mesopotamian religion and mythology made the Apkallu tradition accessible to broader audiences beyond the specialist community of cuneiformists, incorporating these figures into general accounts of ancient Near Eastern religion and its influence on subsequent traditions. The latter half of the 20th century witnessed the emergence of new approaches to the study of ancient religions that emphasized their social and political functions, while also attending to questions of transmission and reception across cultural boundaries. Scholars working within these frameworks investigated the ways in which traditions concerning primordial revelation and divine transmission of knowledge had served to legitimate particular institutions and practices within Mesopotamian society, while also tracing the transformations these traditions underwent as they were adopted and adapted by other cultures. The Apkallu tradition proved particularly illuminating for such investigations, given its explicit concern with the origins and transmission of civilized arts and its demonstrable influence across multiple cultural contexts. The association between the Apkallu and Scribal institutions, the invocation of these figures in royal ideology, and the preservation of their names and attributes in ritual texts all provided evidence for the social embeddedness of mythological traditions and their functions within the communities that maintained them. The study of comparative mythology, which had developed alongside the recovery of ancient Near Eastern materials during the 19th century, provided frameworks for understanding the Apkallu tradition in relation to parallel traditions from other cultures concerning divine or semi-divine beings who had transmitted civilization to humanity. James George Fraser's monumental compilation The Golden Bough, first published in 1890 and subsequently expanded through multiple editions, assembled evidence from cultures worldwide concerning dying and rising gods, sacred kingship, and other religious phenomena that Fraser interpreted through an evolutionary framework that understood all religions as progressing through similar stages of development. While Fraser's specific interpretations have been largely superseded, his work and that of other comparative mythologists established the scholarly practice of examining religious traditions cross-culturally and identifying structural parallels that might reflect common human concerns or actual historical connections. The Apkallu tradition invited comparison with culture hero traditions from diverse contexts, including not only the Greek Prometheus myth that Berossus's readers would have recognized, but also the Mesoamerican tradition of Quetzalcoatl, the Chinese tradition of Fuxi and other sage rulers, and the Polynesian traditions of Maui and similar figures who had obtained fire, agriculture, and other benefits for humanity through their actions. The structural similarities among these traditions raised questions that comparative mythologists approach through different theoretical frameworks. Some scholars emphasize the common features of human social organization and the universal need to explain the origins of civilized practices, suggesting that culture hero myths arose independently in response to similar existential questions. Others trace potential historical connections through migration, trade, or other mechanisms of cultural contact, arguing that structural similarities reflected actual transmission of narrative elements across cultural boundaries. The Apkallu tradition occupied a particularly significant position within these comparative discussions given its antiquity and its documented influence on subsequent traditions within the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. The cuneiform sources that preserved the Apkallu tradition predated by millennia the Greek and Roman materials that had formed the primary basis for classical mythology studies, while the demonstrable connections between Mesopotamian tradition and the account of Berossus provided evidence for actual mechanisms of transmission that could be investigated through historical and philological methods. The Apkallu tradition thus served as a test case for theories concerning the transmission of mythological traditions and the processes by which narrative elements might be preserved, transformed, or lost as they passed between cultures. The 20th century development of structuralist approaches to mythology, associated particularly with the work of Claude Lévi-Strauss, offered new frameworks for understanding the significance of mythological traditions independently of questions concerning their historical origins or transmission. Structuralist analysis focused on the underlying patterns and oppositions that organize mythological narratives, arguing that these patterns reflected fundamental structures of human thought rather than particular historical experiences or borrowed narrative elements. The Apkallu tradition, with its systematic organization of 7 sages associated with 7 antediluvian cities, and its clear structural opposition between the primordial time of revelation and the post-diluvian period of human civilization, invited structuralist analysis that could illuminate the conceptual frameworks within which Mesopotamian thought operated. The application of structuralist and post-structuralist approaches to ancient Near Eastern materials generated productive scholarship, while also revealing the limitations of theoretical frameworks, developed primarily through analysis of non-literate societies when applied to the complex textual traditions of ancient Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian sources that preserved the Apkallu tradition represented not the oral traditions of a non-literate society, but the written productions of a highly developed scribal culture that had engaged in sophisticated manipulation and transformation of traditional materials across millennia of documented history. The recognition of this complexity required approaches that combined the insights of structural analysis with attention to the historical processes through which traditions had been preserved, modified, and transmitted within and between literate cultures. The contemporary study of the Apkallu tradition thus draws upon multiple disciplinary perspectives and methodological approaches that have developed over more than a century of scholarly engagement with recovered Mesopotamian materials. Assyriologists continue to publish new editions and interpretations of cuneiform sources that illuminate aspects of the tradition previously obscure, while scholars working in religious studies, comparative mythology, and ancient history integrate these findings into broader frameworks for understanding ancient religions and their legacies. The digital humanities have provided new tools for accessing and analysing the vast corpus of cuneiform materials, with online databases making cuneiform texts available to researchers worldwide, and computational methods enabling new forms of textual analysis. The ongoing excavation of Mesopotamian sites, despite the disruptions caused by political instability in the region, continues to bring new materials to light that occasionally transform understanding of previously known traditions. The question of what the Apkallu tradition ultimately signifies, beyond its historical importance as an early attempt to explain the origins of civilization, remains open to diverse interpretations that reflect the perspectives and concerns of different interpreters. For scholars focused on the reconstruction of ancient Mesopotamian religion and culture, the Apkallu tradition provides evidence for understanding how ancient peoples conceptualized the relationship between divine and human realms, the origins of knowledge and technique, and the nature of cosmic and historical time. For scholars interested in the history of ideas and the transmission of concepts across cultural boundaries, the Apkallu tradition illustrates the processes by which mythological traditions might survive cultural transformations through selective preservation and creative adaptation, while also demonstrating the inevitable losses that accompanied such transmission. For scholars concerned with the comparative study of religions and the identification of patterns in human religious thought, the Apkallu tradition offers a particularly ancient and well-documented example of culture hero mythology that can be examined in relation to similar traditions from other times and places. The popular reception of the Apkallu tradition in contemporary culture has followed trajectories that sometimes diverge significantly from scholarly interpretation. The fish-cloaked appearance of the Apkallu, their association with profound wisdom transmitted from superior beings to humanity, and their connection to a catastrophic flood that destroyed an earlier world, have all invited incorporation into alternative history narratives that interpret the tradition as preserving memories of actual contact between ancient humans and extraterrestrial visitors, or survivors of lost advanced civilizations. These interpretations, which lack support within academic scholarship, nonetheless reflect genuine human fascination with questions about the origins of civilization and the possibility that human history might be more complex than conventional frameworks acknowledge. The academic study of the Apkallu tradition provides materials for understanding how ancient peoples themselves grappled with such questions, while also demonstrating the sophisticated frameworks they developed for organizing knowledge about the past and transmitting it to future generations. The physical representations of the Apkallu that survive from ancient Mesopotamia continue to exercise profound aesthetic and symbolic power that transcends their original religious and political contexts. The monumental reliefs from Assyrian palaces that depicted fish-cloaked figures performing ritual gestures have become iconic images of ancient Mesopotamian civilization, reproduced in museum displays, scholarly publications, and popular media worldwide. The survival of these images, alongside the textual sources that explain their significance, provides an unusually complete picture of an ancient religious tradition, allowing modern viewers to encounter both the visual forms through which the tradition was expressed and the conceptual content that informed those forms. The Apkallu figures that once protected Assyrian kings and sanctified palace spaces now serve different functions as objects of scholarly study, aesthetic appreciation, and cultural heritage, their journey from living religious symbols to museum artifacts illustrating the transformations that ancient traditions undergo as they pass through changing historical contexts. The recovery of the Apkallu tradition from the obscurity into which it had fallen represents one small but significant element within the broader modern project of recovering and understanding the ancient past. The cuneiform tablets that preserved the tradition remained buried beneath Mesopotamian mounds for millennia after the scribes who inscribed them had died and the institutions that employed them had ceased to function, their contents inaccessible until modern scholarship developed the tools necessary for their decipherment and interpretation. The knowledge that the Apkallu tradition attributed to primordial divine revelation, the practical arts of civilization that the sages had supposedly transmitted to antediluvian humanity, was in fact the accumulated achievement of countless generations of human beings who had developed and refined these arts through millennia of collective effort. Yet the tradition itself, the framework within which ancient Mesopotamians had understood and transmitted knowledge about their past, represented a genuine cultural achievement whose recovery has enriched modern understanding of human intellectual history and the diverse ways in which different cultures have conceptualized the origins and nature of knowledge. The questions that the Apkallu tradition ultimately poses to modern interpreters extend beyond matters of historical reconstruction and philological analysis to touch upon fundamental issues concerning the relationship between myth and meaning, the functions of sacred narrative in human societies, and the persistence of certain conceptual patterns across widely separated cultures and historical periods. The Mesopotamian scribes who compiled the king lists, who inscribed the ritual texts, who created the monumental reliefs depicting fish-cloaked figures performing protective gestures, were engaged in activities that served immediate practical purposes within their own cultural contexts, while simultaneously participating in broader human endeavours that transcend those specific contexts. Their efforts to preserve and transmit knowledge about the primordial past, to maintain connections with sources of wisdom believed to originate beyond human capacity, and to structure understanding of historical time according to meaningful patterns that distinguish between different cosmic epochs, all reflect concerns that have manifested in diverse forms across human cultures throughout recorded history, and presumably extending back into periods for which no direct records survive. The particular form that these concerns took in Mesopotamian tradition, the specific configuration of 7 antediluvian sages who received divine wisdom and transmitted it to human communities before a catastrophic flood terminated the primordial era, represented one solution to problems that all complex societies must address concerning the origins and legitimation of the knowledge systems upon which they depend. Every civilization requires explanations for why its fundamental practices and institutions take the forms they do, requires frameworks for distinguishing between authoritative and unauthorized knowledge, and requires mechanisms for transmitting accumulated wisdom across generations while maintaining the authority of that wisdom against challenges from innovation or foreign influence. The Apkallu tradition provided Mesopotamian civilization with resources for addressing all these requirements, offering mythological foundations for practical knowledge, genealogies of transmission that linked contemporary practitioners to primordial sources, and conceptual frameworks that situated human learning within cosmic context that enhanced its significance and authority. The catastrophic flood that terminated the antediluvian era and separated the age of the Apkallu from subsequent historical time served multiple functions within this conceptual framework that deserve consideration as the narrative of the sages reaches its conclusion. The flood represented simultaneously a moment of profound loss and a guarantee of the exceptional value of whatever survived it. The knowledge that the Apkallu had transmitted, the traditions that traced their origins to the primordial sages, acquired enhanced authority precisely because they had endured through a cosmic catastrophe that had destroyed so much else. The antediluvian world in which the sages had walked among humans, in which divine wisdom had been directly accessible to mortal recipients, became a golden age whose passing was lamented, but whose legacy survived in the institutions and practices that the sages had established before the waters rose. This structure, the combination of catastrophic rupture with selective continuity, allowed Mesopotamian tradition to acknowledge the vast gulf separating contemporary practice from its mythological origins, while simultaneously maintaining meaningful connections across that gulf through traditions of transmission that linked present practitioners to primordial sources. The figure of Utnapishti, the flood hero who preserved life through the catastrophe and received the secrets of immortality from the gods, occupied a pivotal position within this framework as the link between the antediluvian world of the Apkallu and the post-diluvian world of ordinary human history. His role as recipient and transmitter of wisdom across the boundary of the flood made him a bridge figure whose significance extended beyond his survival of the catastrophe itself to encompass his function as guardian of knowledge that might otherwise have perished with the antediluvian world. The famous encounter between Gilgamesh and Utnapishti in the Epic of Gilgamesh dramatized the relationship between post-diluvian humanity, represented by the heroic but mortal king of Uruk, and the preserved wisdom of the antediluvian era, embodied in the flood survivor who had witnessed the primordial world and remembered what had been lost. Gilgamesh's failure to obtain immortality from Utnapishti, his inability to stay awake for 7 days, or to retain the plant of rejuvenation, illustrated the limitations that separated post-diluvian humanity from the exceptional status of those who had known the antediluvian world directly, while the narrative itself transmitted wisdom about mortality and the proper response to human limitations that the encounter had occasioned. The 7 sages themselves, having completed their civilizing mission before the flood, withdrew from direct involvement in human affairs into a mode of existence that the sources describe in terms suggesting both presence and absence, both continued influence and fundamental inaccessibility. The wisdom they had transmitted remained available to those who preserved and studied the traditions deriving from their teachings, but the direct contact between divine beings and human communities that had characterized the antediluvian era had ended with the flood, replaced by mediated forms of access that depended upon properly maintained traditions of transmission and interpretation. The Apkallu, who appeared in later periods, the human sages who bore the title that had originally designated the primordial 7, represented not the return of the original figures, but the continuation of traditions that traced their authority to those figures, the preservation of connections to primordial sources through institutional mechanisms that the sages themselves had supposedly established before their withdrawal. This pattern of primordial revelation, followed by institutional preservation, appeared not only in the Apkallu tradition specifically, but throughout Mesopotamian religious and intellectual culture more broadly, reflecting fundamental assumptions about the nature and sources of legitimate knowledge that distinguished ancient Mesopotamian thought from modern frameworks. Where modern epistemology generally privileges innovation, discovery, and the progressive accumulation of knowledge through research and experimentation, Mesopotamian tradition tended to privilege antiquity, revelation, and the faithful preservation of wisdom transmitted from authoritative sources. The scribal schools that trained successive generations of cuneiform specialists understood themselves not as institutions for the production of new knowledge, but as custodians of traditions that derived their authority from their antiquity and their ultimate origins in divine revelation. The Apkallu tradition provided mythological foundations for this epistemological orientation, explaining why ancient wisdom possessed authority that later editions could not match, and why proper transmission of inherited knowledge took precedence over individual innovation. The implications of this epistemological difference extend to questions about how the Apkallu tradition itself should be understood and evaluated from modern perspectives. Contemporary scholars approaching the tradition bring assumptions about knowledge and its sources that differ fundamentally from those held by the ancient scribes who created and transmitted the tradition, creating possibilities for both insight and misunderstanding in the interpretive encounter. The recognition that the Apkallu tradition served functions within Mesopotamian society that modern institutions address through different means can facilitate appreciation of the tradition's sophistication and its effective operation within its original context. The knowledge that the sages supposedly transmitted to humanity, the practical arts of civilization, whose origins the tradition explained, represented genuine achievements of Mesopotamian culture that comparison with other ancient and modern civilizations reveals to have been remarkably advanced in numerous fields. The astronomical observations, the mathematical techniques, the medical practices, the literary compositions, and the architectural achievements of ancient Mesopotamia all testified to high levels of accomplishment that required explanation, and the Apkallu tradition provided one framework for understanding how such accomplishments had become possible. The transmission of the Apkallu tradition across cultural and linguistic boundaries, from Sumerian to Akkadian to Aramaic to Greek, and potentially beyond, illustrated both the persistence of certain mythological patterns and the transformations they undergo as they move between contexts. The Babylonian historian Berossus, writing in Greek for Hellenistic audiences in the 3rd century BCE, transmitted versions of the tradition that adapted Mesopotamian concepts to Greek categories, while preserving recognizable elements that can be traced back to much earlier Sumerian sources. His account of Oans and the other fishmen who emerged from the sea to teach humanity the arts of civilization represented the Apkallu tradition filtered through multiple layers of transmission and translation, maintaining core narrative elements while adapting them to new cultural frameworks and intellectual concerns. The survival of Berossus's account in fragmentary form through citations in later Greek and Christian authors extended the transmission chain further, carrying echoes of Sumerian mythology into late antique and medieval contexts that could not have accessed the original cuneiform sources directly. The modern recovery of the cuneiform sources that preserve the Apkallu tradition in its original Mesopotamian forms has made possible comparisons between the Greek transmission and the Akkadian and Sumerian originals that reveal both the continuities and the transformations involved in cross-cultural transmission. The recognition that Berossus's Oan corresponded to the Sumerian figure of Uana, the first and greatest of the 7 sages, confirmed the essential accuracy of the Greek author's account while also revealing the modifications that had occurred as the tradition passed through successive cultural filters. The recovery of king lists, ritual texts, and other sources that mentioned the Apkallu in their original contexts has provided materials for understanding the tradition far more fully than would have been possible from the Greek transmission alone, while the Greek sources have in turn provided evidence for how the tradition was received and adapted by audiences outside Mesopotamia. This comparative perspective illuminates both the specific history of the Apkallu tradition and broader questions about how mythological traditions survive, transform, and continue to exercise influence across cultural and temporal boundaries. The archaeological recovery of the physical representations of the Apkallu, particularly the monumental reliefs from Neo-Assyrian palaces that depicted fish-cloaked figures in ritual contexts, has added visual dimensions to the textual record that enhance understanding of how the tradition functioned within the material culture of ancient Mesopotamia. These images, carved in stone and originally positioned at doorways and around sacred spaces within palace complexes, represented the Apkallu as protective presences, whose depiction in appropriate locations could channel apotropaic power against malevolent forces. The combination of fish elements with human forms that characterized these representations reflected the tradition's emphasis on the liminal status of the sages, beings who belonged neither wholly to the human realm nor wholly to the divine, but who mediated between these realms in ways that made them uniquely capable of transmitting wisdom across ontological boundaries. The ritual gestures depicted in the reliefs, the pine cones and buckets that the figures held and manipulated, corresponded to purification ceremonies, whose performance was believed to protect spaces and persons from demonic influence, connecting the visual imagery to practical religious activities that extended the sages' protective functions into contemporary contexts. The eventual disappearance of the Apkallu tradition from living religious practice accompanied the broader decline of cuneiform culture and the institutions that had maintained it. The scribal schools that had trained specialists in cuneiform writing and transmitted the textual traditions associated with the sages, gradually ceased to function as Greek and Aramaic replaced Akkadian as the dominant languages of Mesopotamian urban centres. The temples and palaces where rituals invoking the Apkallu had been performed fell into disuse, and eventually into ruin, their reliefs buried beneath accumulating debris that would preserve them for modern recovery while removing them from living religious contexts. The priests and scholars who had maintained the traditions, who had copied the tablets and performed the rituals and transmitted the knowledge supposedly deriving from the primordial sages, died without successors who continued their specialized training, breaking chains of transmission that had extended across millennia. The tradition that had explained the origins of civilization itself became one more element within the civilization that had preserved it, subject to the same processes of decline and disappearance that affected all aspects of ancient Mesopotamian culture. Yet the tradition's disappearance was never complete, for the materials through which it had been expressed proved more durable than the institutions that had created them. The clay tablets inscribed with cuneiform signs, fired either intentionally or accidentally in the destructions that accompanied the fall of ancient cities, survived burial for millennia in conditions that would have destroyed organic writing materials. The stone reliefs carved into the walls of Assyrian palaces, toppled and buried when those palaces were sacked and burned, remained intact beneath the mounds that gradually formed over the ruins of once great cities. The tradition persisted in these material forms, inaccessible but not destroyed, waiting for the development of archaeological techniques and philological skills that could recover and interpret it. The 19th and 20th century excavations that brought the tablets and reliefs back to light, the scholarly labour that deciphered the scripts and reconstructed the languages in which the tradition had been recorded, gradually assembled the materials from which the Apkallu tradition could be reconstructed in modern understanding, completing a transmission process that had been interrupted for 2 millennia. The Apkallu tradition, as it exists today, recovered from ancient sources and reconstructed through scholarly interpretation, serves purposes that differ fundamentally from those it served in its original context, while continuing to address questions that remain relevant to contemporary audiences. The tradition no longer functions as a living religious framework that explains the origins of legitimate knowledge and provides mythological foundations for practical arts. For modern societies rely on different epistemological frameworks and different mechanisms for legitimating expertise. Yet the questions that the tradition addressed concerning the origins of civilization and the sources of human knowledge, concerning the relationship between divine and human realms, concerning the nature of wisdom and the proper means for its transmission, remain questions that human beings continue to ask, and for which modern frameworks provide answers that are no more final or certain than those offered by ancient Mesopotamian tradition. The study of the Apkallu tradition, understood within its original context and appreciated for the sophistication of its conceptual achievements, can illuminate both the distinctive features of ancient Mesopotamian thought and the broader human concerns that such thought addressed in culturally specific forms. The 7 sages who descended from divine realms to teach humanity the arts of civilization before the Great Flood terminated the primordial era represent one of humanity's oldest attempts to explain its own development, to account for the knowledge and techniques that distinguished human life from mere animal existence, and to establish meaningful connections between human activities and cosmic sources of meaning and authority. The tradition that preserved their memory across millennia of Mesopotamian history, that transmitted their legacy through the rise and fall of empires and the succession of languages and scripts, that survived in fragmentary form through Greek intermediaries and more fully through the clay tablets that 19th century archaeologists recovered from Mesopotamian mounds, testifies to the enduring human need to understand origins and to maintain connections with authoritative sources of wisdom. The Apkallu themselves, whether understood as genuine divine beings who once walked among humanity, or as mythological constructs that served cultural functions within ancient Mesopotamian society, continue to exercise influence as subjects of scholarly study, as elements within broader investigations of ancient mythology and religion, and as examples of the sophisticated conceptual frameworks that ancient civilizations developed for organizing knowledge about their pasts and transmitting it to future generations. The waters of the Great Flood receded long ago according to the tradition's own chronology, leaving behind a transformed world in which direct contact between divine sages and human communities had become impossible. Yet the wisdom that the Apkallu had transmitted, the arts and sciences and religious practices that they had taught to antediluvian humanity, survived the catastrophe through the preservation efforts of the flood hero and continued to sustain human civilization through the long millennia that followed. The tradition of the Seven Sages thus offered its original audiences both an explanation for the remarkable accomplishments of their civilization and a framework for understanding their own relationship to the primordial sources of that civilization's wisdom. For modern audiences approaching the tradition through the lens of historical and philological scholarship, the Apkallu represent something equally significant though differently conceived: evidence for the sophistication and creativity of ancient Mesopotamian thought, materials for comparative study of mythological patterns across cultures, and testimony to the enduring human engagement with questions about origins, knowledge, and the nature of wisdom itself that the tradition so memorably addressed. The sages who emerge from the depths bearing gifts of civilization for humanity have themselves emerged from the depths of historical time, recovered through scholarly effort from the obscurity into which they had fallen, their story now available to audiences who encounter it not as religious truth, but as cultural heritage, whose significance extends across the millennia, separating their world from our own.